Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. I'm here today to talk to Brian Palmer about the third volume in his Capitalism and Colonialism series, which was just released. And it's a wonderful honor. I'm going to record a proper introduction for you after the fact, but it's a real honor. I've really enjoyed reading this series, and I think it's a great pleasure. It's going to be a fun conversation to sit down with you and talk about it now that it's finally finished and completed. So for listeners who may not be aware of the series, do you mind taking some of our listeners through what exactly you're trying to accomplish with this new history of Canada, so to speak?
Okay, well, thanks very much for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. Really, the origins of this book, or this 3 volumes, was that I had been asked in 2018, just before the pandemic, by Jim Lorimer to write a history of capitalism in Canada. And I said, well, you cannot really write that kind of history nowadays without addressing colonialism. And he agreed, and we came to a gentleman's agreement that, I would write about an 80,000 word history of colonialism and capitalism in Canada for the period 1500 to the present. It quickly got out of control, and when I emerged from my kind of study 2.5 years later, it was over 400,000 words, and we went back and forth. Jim originally wanted it to be 1 volume. I always said 2. He said no. Eventually, it ended up being 3. The origins of it lay in part, I suppose, intellectually. It was the last class I taught before I retired at Trent University in the program of the Frost Center's program in Canadian and Indigenous Studies. Was a required MA course, and the students in that course could universally accept that Canada was a colonial project, had been from its beginnings, was still, and that needed to be challenged and confronted and overcome the legacies of that colonial experience. But they balked at seeing capitalism as part of the equation. And so I thought it was important to actually bring these to what I consider to be foundational structures of Canadian historical being and the making of the nation state in Canada together. And my project really was animated also by being a socialist. That's fundamental to the texts. And really, my concern was that historically, those struggles, those moments of resistance, those periods of opposition to colonialism on the one hand, which were often led by Métis or Indigenous peoples, and those struggles that could potentially be anti-capitalist. They weren't always anti-capitalist, but potentially could be against capitalism organized by workers, labor activists, and sympathizers. That those 2 streams of challenge to capitalism and colonialism had never really forcefully come together and bonded and made a common cause. And so, in some senses, what I wanted to look at was both the history of the making of a Canada that was colonial and capitalist, and the ways that there had been struggles against components of this, and the necessity in our own time to bring those struggles together. And that's really the purpose behind the book. And intellectually, I did not think that kind of a study, that kind of argument had existed in Canada sufficiently well. There had been pieces that gestured towards it, but it wasn't really developed. And you had the last time that Canadian historians really wrote large, big picture histories was really in the 1940s and 50s when you had, Donald Creighton and Arthur Lower writing. And the project really was about the sort of march of the sort of, great merchants who were part of the mercantile empire of the St. Lawrence, or Lower's story of, the march from colony to nation. And
Or the
these
great men,
and
right?
all of
Crichton's,
these histories were
MacDonald.
really animated by great men. And then Conrad Black added a massive 1,000 page tome, which was even more a sort of pay-on to the elite. So in some senses, my project was very different, a challenge to this. It drew on past historiographies of the left, but it also, I think, extended them. So that's really how the books came into being.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that I had initially, was that difference that you have with past historiographies. And the first one that came to mind was Stanley Ryerson, mostly because he's the one that I have in my shelf
Yeah.
behind me. But right, even his work mostly leans towards the capitalism side, but not necessarily the decolonization side of things, at least in those earlier volumes. So I agree with you that pushing those two narratives into a kind of parallel or intertwined stream is a really important development in the project of writing Canadian history, certainly. Yeah, I don't know. You looked like you wanted to add something. I'll let you.
No,
Okay.
I think historians of my sensibility owe a great debt to Stanley Ryerson. And in fact, as the first volume of this went to copy editing, one of the copy editors, who was an old leftist who'd worked around the Last Post in Quebec and knew Stanley Ryerson, said, "Oh wow, this kind of reminds me a bit of Stanley Ryerson." And that, I think I'll take that as an honorable coupling. Um, I think that Ryerson, so embedded in the national question in Quebec, um, and also so focused on instances of the struggle for democracy in Quebec, like the 1837-38 rebellions, wrote really impressive histories. And his first book, The Founding of Canada, which covered the period up to 1815, was really way ahead of its time, and in actually dealing with Indigenous peoples and colonization. But mainly his writing on this level of historical reconstruction stopped with Confederation. And, the 1867, 1873 period is when he kind of ends his study of the unequal union of the Canadas. And for most leftists in the current moment, that's almost prehistory. It's almost like the age of the dinosaurs. I mean, I am amazed at how little is known among a lot of contemporary young leftists about, the 19th century, let alone the 18th. And yet these are centuries running, I would argue, from 1500 to 1890, which the first volume of my sort of trilogy covers. This is a long period of gestation that in some senses lays the groundwork upon which modern Canada in the 1890 to 1960 period comes into being. And then this, as a consequence, this is the legacy that we live with in the remaking of Canada that I argue took place from really 1960 to the present.
Absolutely. One of the things, and this was not a planned question, it was just an interesting thought that occurred to me as you were recounting this answer. You mentioned that your students bucked up against the idea of Canada as a capitalist state, right? Or that capitalism is intrinsically tied into Canadian history. And I'm curious if you have thoughts. This is an impromptu question, so feel free to ignore me on this one. Like why that would be the case, right? Because it seems, maybe I'm too much of a lefty, right, to not see it as obvious, but it seems like something that would flow naturally from an assumption that colonialism and capitalism tie together, right? So why would they buck up against that, do you think?
Well, I had your instinctual response as well. It kind of shocked me at first, but when I began to think about it, there are really, I think, two streams and two elements that, and maybe many more, but these are the two that I kind of tweaked on at the time. A number of the students in the course that I taught were Indigenous because the Frost Center ran a program for Canadian and Indigenous studies. And it makes sense that Indigenous people are going to focus very much on colonialism, okay? And that they have a certain, and rightly so, purchase on, articulating their particular oppression, and it's one that non-Indigenous peoples really need to confront more frontally. So there's that, and they would see. I think instinctually, although I wasn't in my teaching ever a heavy kind of indoctrinaire kind of impose my Marxist framework. But, it's subtle. It was subtle, I think, but it was certainly there, and they could see this. And there is, in many Indigenous studies programs, there is almost an instinctual reaction that Marxism is a European import. And so, and a critique of capitalism posed very frontally, it sort of draws that out, right? And so that's one point. The other point is, particularly for young people who have sort of come to political and intellectual maturity in the last decades, if you look at the whole arsenal of legitimation that is part of the hegemonic hold that capitalism exercises in modern societies, in Canada, as an example of that intellectual, political, cultural, social apparatus has been willing to acknowledge, I would say rhetorically rather than materially and substantively, colonialism as something that has to be redressed. You see this in, almost every, state pronouncement, and particularly in the, under the reign of Trudeau the Younger, it was very much evident rhetorically. So a lot of young people have grown up with the ideological apparatus of the society they live in, recognizing colonialism as a problem. Now, there's been virtually nothing done to actually redress seriously the problems, I would argue, but the patina of a response has been there. Okay, what about capitalism? Well, capitalism in that same ideological, apparatus is extolled as the virtue of of the rise of the meritocracy. People can, have freedoms. They can exist within that, entity of the marketplace that is always fair and just and equal. And so they've confronted that. And if they don't have a political set of structures that are challenging that. And this is one of the premises of my book on the tragedy of the post 1960s era is that far left challenge has largely been obliterated. So capitalism, while it is in constant crisis, it seems to me, is not a crisis of capitalism and its hegemony and legitimation, because the opposition to it, effective opposition, has not really been there. So it seems to me that those two elements, in the class I was teaching came together, and they are reflected in the society at large, I think, in the current political moment.
Absolutely. I agree with you on the ideological side, right, of being kind of subsumed into the assumptions of, market ideologies. To add on to the declarations about colonialism, I was recently teaching a class in Manitoba for an intensive class, and one of the things that we talked about was the Japanese Canadian internment camps, right, that happened in the 40s, and how under the Mulroney government in the late 80s, there was an apology, right? A formal state apology for this, right? And there's a fantastic clip by the CBC that talks about this moment and how there's money being given back to the Japanese community in Canada and so on, and that there's a formal apology. And then the presenter ends her segment with, no one pretends like this is actually going to rectify the history, but it's something. It's just a great moment of completely disavowing any kind of material change or even on some level, right, ideological change about what actually is occurring. And that's just an example that comes to mind to add on to what you were saying, which I fully agree with in
Yeah.
this particular
Yeah, I
instance.
mean, and you could reproduce that for indigenous peoples
Oh yeah,
over
for
and over
sure,
again.
for
You
sure.
know, one of the most latest being the Catholic Church's, requirement, which they agreed to pay restitution for residential school students being abused under their, custodial care. And yet, and the Pope even made this pilgrimage to Canada to, in 2022 or 23, and I cover that in the book, and made what some considered an apology, but was pretty, evasive in terms of the church's ultimate responsibility, passing it off on bad actors in the church, stressing that the state was really responsible, and basically later, subsequently, trying to kind of deny that it had ever, actually articulated the notion of the doctrine of discovery, which of course it had in various papal bulls, going back even much centuries prior to actually indigenous European contact in Canada. So yeah, talk is cheap. Actually delivering some kind of resolution of colonialism's myriad legacies and quite destructive legacies, uh, much more difficult for a political economy embedded in capitalism and colonialism to redress.
Going off of another answer or another segment of your answers and tying it more fully to volume 3 of your series now. So you mentioned that it seems to you that capitalism is always in crisis, right? In some way, shape, or form. And you do see some of these crises in the 18th and 19th century, for example, here specifically in Canada, but also across the world. And yet, specifically, you name volume 3, Capitalism, Colonialism, and Crises, right? Why did you choose to emphasize the crises in the more modern history of Canada and not the crises, for example, that would have happened at other points in Canadian history? What is it about the modern era post 1960 that you felt that made you feel the need to emphasize that crisis aspect?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it very much relates to what younger people today live with. Um, I have throughout the book, I do stress capitalism's inherent tendency towards crisis, and the first really great global crisis of capital, for instance, in the 1820s, one could argue, had a devastating impact on Montreal's economy. And throughout the 19th century, there were major recessions in the 1850s, 1870s, and 1890s. So it isn't the fact that crisis is new. What I would argue is that under later capitalism, and which some have called late capitalism, the inherent tendency for capitalism to descend into crisis seems to me to be accelerating. In other words, the body of capitalism is aging, and as someone who lives with this on a actual daily basis myself, I can appreciate as the body ages of capitalism, the tendency for parts of it to fall off or to wither or to kind of stop functioning in the way they did when capitalism was much younger. This seems to be accelerating. So, for instance, my generation was born in some senses, what was capitalism's last great hurrah, the post World War II period of supposed affluence and, things looked very rosy. I mean, Laurier opened the 20th century by saying this will be the century of Canada. And he was buying into the notion that capitalist development was going to actually be fueled by Canada's, was going to fuel Canada's progress and advance. And, to some extent, if you saw capitalism's capacities to deliver some things that previous and earlier forms of capital had more trouble delivering, then it was to some extent true. It was only in the later 1920s that a working class family could live, if things went right, which they didn't always do, on a working man's wage. Okay, it had never been able to actually do that in times past. But that moment of so-called capitalism's golden age and great successes in the 1945 to 1965 years, they were still punctuated by recessions and downturns to some extent, but things looked fairly good, looked fairly rosy. After that, things started to unravel. And for people who are under the age of 50, that is people born, sometime in or after the mid to late 1970s, the only thing they've known, it seems to me, is a capitalism which has, been facing incredibly volatility. You started in the mid 1970s with the fiscal crisis of the state, which induced Trudeau Sr. to pass wage and price controls. The 80s was a period of stagflation, economic stagnation, massive inflation. I mean, we think inflation is a problem now. In the early 1980s, the interest rates at banks approached 20%. I mean, I think younger people, and we've forgotten this, younger people can't really fathom this in some senses. There has been deindustrialization, where, job loss in industrial sectors, the textile sector, for instance, Montreal and industrial Quebec decimated. The Maritimes, that deindustrialization started in the 1920s, but has continued. The auto sector in Ontario, plant closures. I mean, Trump's, assault with tariffs is just a part of a long history from the 1970s on of plant closures and shutdowns and shorter time and constriction of workplaces. So, and fiscal crises, starting in the 90s with the fiscal crises of the rising, Asian and economies, Japan, etc. But then mounting with the 2007-8 financial meltdown and the mortgage crisis, and then increasing, problems. And then you add to that capitalism's long-standing deterioration and destruction of the ecology, which has manifestations which I believe are rooted in terms of, the destruction of biodiversity, to the rise of pandemics, for instance, and the COVID-19 was simply the most destructive, but there were threatening sounds, echoes of the possibilities of this much earlier with the avian flu threat, and then we've got Ebola in Africa. I mean, all of these things are creating crises for capitalism that then manifest themselves in a political economy of which Trump is the major articulation of bourgeois states stepping outside of past practices to go on really sort of wildly oscillating and discombobulating, policy orientations. So we have not lived since the mid 1970s for any 5 year. 5 years is about all that the short shelf life of capitalist prosperity seems to be able to offer. Before that, it could offer, longer periods. But we have to remember too, the 20th century is a period of two, world wars, a major, depression, and capitalism survived that by creating regulations that, could, ease the discomfort and stop the bloodletting when it appeared to happen. I think, the reason I say we're in a moment of permanent crisis or perpetual crises is I think now the advanced capitalist states are starting also to atrophy to the point where that regulation is A, being dispensed with, and B, can't really stop the bloodletting anymore in an effective way. Now, it doesn't mean we're on the moment of some revolutionary rupture and the defeat of capitalism and colonialism, because as the books try to point out, the left opposition that would actually oppose colonialism and capitalism together doesn't exist at the moment. And the process of building that is a long, protracted, and difficult, struggle.
Absolutely. And your answer makes me think of the Milton and Acorn epigraph that you put at the beginning of Volume 3, which I'm partial to because I enjoy Acorn's poetry quite a bit. Right, but there's a few lines at the end where he said, "And since our history's been misused, old mistakes are often repeated." And this point that you made about Trump being just the, I guess, epitome of a long series of actions against state regulation or any kind of holdback against the market forces of capitalism, I think ties in quite nicely with that epigraph. And this is a discussion that I've had with people before of a lot of the politicians like Trump being essentially mirrors or echoes of 19th century politicians prior to these labor regulations or just state regulations in general, right? And so you see this kind of historical repetition happening in that sense, while also, as you were pointing to, also repeating some of the mistakes of fueling, how would I articulate this? Fueling a working class that has difficulty actually, I'm losing my words. Fueling a working class that actually has the capacity to fight against this ongoing process.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, the point there, I think, really is that with the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and beyond, most people have associated neoliberalism with globalization, free trade, certainly the veneration of the market as not just the invisible hand, but the iron fist that kind of rules societies, whether we like it or not. And if that's the way you regard neoliberalism, then Trump seems a real anomaly, because at a time when he's espousing Make America Great Again and America First and protectionism, tariffs, etc., it seems to be a step outside of neoliberalism. In the books, I try to argue something quite different, which is that neoliberalism was really about the disciplining of a working class that over the course of this great moment of affluence in the golden age of capitalism had been given certain concessions by capital, because far-seeing capital and the state that served its interests recognized that workers could blow the lid off of this, prosperity by striking too much, by demanding too much. So, and workers had been held back prior to the 1940s. So you had this post-war settlement, it's called, where workers were granted in very limited and constrained ways and with political strings attached the right to collective bargaining, the right to form unions, etc.
Yeah.
And that gave rise to a trade union movement that became, quite significant and powerful in some senses. But it also hemmed in that trade union movement with a labor leadership that was committed to what capitalism could deliver and was willing to sign off on the bargain that it had to police its members, that it had to basically discipline dissidents within its ranks, like members of the Communist Party and other, radical revolutionary socialists who had been pivotal in organizing workers over the 30s and 40s. So you had this bargain between, in some senses, labor and capital. The problem was when the economy started to falter, when capitalism entered into this period of permanent crises, both the state and capital began to fight back. What they gave on the one hand in a moment of seeming moment of affluence to shore up their power and authority, they could then, with that power and authority, claw back those gains and concessions.
And blame the workers and their rights for it.
And so for too long, and even up to this moment, I would argue, a more ossified trade union bureaucracy or leadership has basically failed to actually kind of ignite a workers' movement where the animating slogan, "an injury to one is an injury to all," should be the sort of banner under which it marches. And that's really been the story of neoliberalism's success. It needed to discipline workers in order to get free trade. Once it had free trade, and once it continued to confront the problems of an atrophying, aging capitalism, then the way is paved for a bourgeois politician like Trump to kind of say, this isn't working. I'm going to appeal to the downtrodden, as well as kind of placate the rich with tax concessions, and we're going to continue to move decisively against those who resist, who more and more were less and less the labor movement per se, and more peoples of color, immigrants, etc. And you get a system, capitalism, that proclaimed and validated itself, proclaimed its justifications and validated itself on the basis of freedoms, moving into the realm of unfreedom in really drastic and devastating ways.
Absolutely. I want to add on a question here. So you've been talking about globalization and neoliberalization, and these are phenomenons that we've seen in the United Kingdom, right, under Thatcher, for example, and the United States, as you've just mentioned, and Canada, as the world has become simultaneously more and more connected and isolated in many ways. So one might ask, right, is it even fair, or can we even talk about a history of Canada in this case when it is so connected to the globe in that sense, on the level of economy and politics, right? What is particularly distinctive or unique about a Canadian history in the modern world when we consider those terms?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think it can be answered in two ways. On the one hand, you can say, yeah, the history of Canada pretty much is the same as the history as what was going on in the UK and the US and elsewhere. But of course, every national experience has its own peculiarities and differences, which is precisely why struggles to resist colonialism and capitalism, in particular national settings, never are going to go anywhere if they don't actually address things on the ground and the particularities and specificities. In Canada's case, what's very, I think, what's somewhat unique is that it is right at this intersection of colonialism and capitalism. In the 19th century, far-seeing capitalist and early Canadian nationalist elements like George Brown, who was the editor of the Globe, he said before Confederation, as he gazed from his Toronto perch to the Northwest, which was known as Indian Territory and was still administered then by the Hudson's Bay Company. He said, if Canada can acquire this territory, it will develop from a significant province into the greatest colony that any nation has ever possessed. So there was buried in that sense the notion that in colonizing the West and all that, all the ramifications that had for indigenous peoples located there, you would create a colony within the British Empire that was the jewel of the crown. And many people, and including writers in the 1970s like Kerry Levitt, referred to Canada as the world's richest colony. And so what you've got in Canada is a complexly layered history of colonialism in which competing empires in the pre-1800 period, pre-1760 especially, clashed over the control of indigenous territories in order to extract from them capital that they could accumulate that would provide really the fortunes on which industrial capitalism in the 19th and 20th centuries would develop. And so you had this complicated layering of colonialism in which, these empires were colonizing territories that were indigenous. They were defeating other empires so that the French Canada could be colonized by English Canada. And there are young militants today and activists who dispute the notion that Quebec had a colonial history. I argue against that because I don't think necessarily that because there was an original colonization, it therefore displaces the possibility of other colonizations. And Quebec was subject to English-speaking capitals' incursions and colonizations. There is a national question in Quebec. And the whole history of Canada is layered in this complexity. I mean, our Métis peoples, for instance, colonized peoples. I mean, if you say that they're not, then that's a big problem, I think, for our understanding of indigeneity in Canada. If you say that there are, you are recognizing that even though there was, intermarriage between various European originating groups and indigenous peoples, but it didn't necessarily result in sort of the obliteration or extermination of indigenous cultures and being. And as Canadian capital advanced on the basis of this colonization, at first English-speaking capital, I would say, it moved into becoming not just an appendage of empire, but capable of exercising its own imperialist and colonial aggressions around the world, so that by the 1880s, but really rapidly developing in the 20th century, you saw Canadian capital, particularly in public utilities and transportation sectors, where Canadian capital had long-standing, experience. You saw that Canadian capitalists move decisively into the Caribbean, into Latin America, into parts of Africa and Asia, where they have continued to, play a capitalist, imperialist, colonizing role in extracting from developing economies minerals, resources, and in running tramways, public utilities in Rio de Janeiro, Brascan, which had made immense fortunes in Brazil and Sao Paulo, and ran telecommunications and tramways and public transit, had a monopoly basically on those in the two largest cities in Brazil, was by the 1940s, I think, second only to the Canadian Pacific Railroad in terms of its actual capital assets and and capitalist influence. So you've got in Canada this very layered colonial experience where we are fighting simultaneously against colonialism imposed, on Canada and imposed on Indigenous peoples and imposed on others, and understanding that that fight is also against capitalists who are promoting and benefiting from this colonialism, who, while they are aligned at times with continentalism and integration into the American empire, at times can oppose that empire, as they are ostensibly doing now, but I don't think doing so very effectively. So this is, in some senses, a unique history globally. I mean, you will not find many nation states whose origins lay in colonialism that have the complexity of of the Canadian experience, which makes it interesting to study, but
Mhm.
incredibly difficult to and complicated to challenge effectively.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll add on to the example of Quebec because of the accident of my birth being here right
Mhm.
now. But you see this, right? You mention a few times in the book, right? You talk about the 60s and 70s moment in Quebec, which was a rise in nationalism, right? Or contemporary nationalism here. And part of those groups were, for example, very anti-capitalist. The FLQ is like the most famous example of that, right? Which, um, you know, agree or disagree with their methods, right? Represented some kind of left nationalism. Um, and what you see now in the modern Quebec nationalist is very much a capital inclined nationalism of owning and developing and exploiting those resources on indigenous lands, both here in Quebec, right, and abroad. You see Quebec companies in the United States and Latin America as well, right? There is that drive for expansion that you associate with capital and colonialism. Even on this, I guess you could, I don't know if it's fair to call it a microcosm considering how big Quebec is, but on a smaller scale, right? Even if it is within right, the wider Canadian context. So I just wanted to add on to that and say I agree with you. And you see this kind of doubling of colonized colonizer in a really fascinating way in this sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Quebec case is is very interesting because, and going back to what your point about the 60s, I introduced the third volume, which covers the period 1960 to 2025, with an acknowledgement that the 60s represented in some ways a break from the past bifurcation of the anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles. It's the rise of a new left, which I would situate again the FLQ within, even though I would have a critique, a strong critique of their methods, and
Definitely.
a critique of, for instance, Valier's book, where white and asterisk of America.
Which, to be fair,
Um,
he also later criticized.
what's that?
Which, to
Which
be fair, he also went back on a lot of the
yes,
statements of that book. Yeah.
but that book is layered in homophobia, misogyny,
Yes.
uh, the use of the N word. It has become, in some senses, the scar that book bears in our time. But it does need to be pointed out that Black militants, like the Black Panther Party, were actually very much aligned with Valier and saw that, his use of that word was anti-racist and anti-colonial and anti-capitalist. So again, that speaks to the complications that I'm talking about. But really what the 60s broadly did, which no other decade had actually done, was it potentially, I say, brought together the anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles in the rise of a new left that really did see, okay, we need to address indigenous colonization. We need to address French Canada's legacy of colonialism, and we need to understand that the struggle is against capitalism. And in particular, you had major developments in the indigenous milieu. More indigenous organizations were formed in the 1960 to 63 period, many more that had been formed in the entire 1500 to 1960 years. There was an explosion of youthful radicalism called Red Power among young indigenous activists, which stepped outside of past organizational limitations of First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples. And that Red Power mobilization connected with non-Indigenous New Left developments. It began to study Marxism. There were Métis, a great Métis activist and writer named Howard Adams wrote a book called Prisons of Grass. She published in the 70s. He went to Berkeley, which was a kind of center of New Left activism in the late 60s. He was inspired to become a kind of indigenous activist, listening to Malcolm X speak in the early 60s. You had not had those kind of connections before. And you get the wellspring of indigenous activism, blockades of bridges, occupations of parks, and incredibly important, this was a mobilization that was called pan-Indian activism. It wasn't located in one First Nation. It didn't draw the distinction between Métis and indigenous activism and peoples. It saw the struggle as a struggle of all tribes uniting, and it drew connections to African American struggles in the U.S., to the struggles of blacks in Canada, and even, although it recognized, and Adams was very, very clear on this, it recognized that the white trade union movement, the non-indigenous, largely trade union movement, couldn't be looked to at that moment for a great deal of support, but that bridges had to be built to it, and that working class activists needed to actually recognize the indigenous struggle, and indigenous people struggling were at pains to say, when they marched in Kenora, it isn't just us who are dispossessed and oppressed. It's also you who actually stand against us at times. And, that is the inspiration in some senses for the 3 volumes I've written, trying to get back to that politics of seeing the necessity, not of denying indigenous, the origins of capitalism in Canada as indigenous dispossession, but recognizing that, but also recognizing that dispossession is ongoing, not just for indigenous peoples, but for the vast majority of non-indigenous peoples, because capitalism needs to dispossess, in a kind of metaphorical sense, all of those whom it oppresses and exploits. So that's the significance of the 60s, even though it was short-lived, and even though significant portions of it died and were defeated, other segments of it lived, including, I would argue, that the continuity of indigenous protests, from, Elijah Harper holding up a white feather in the Manitoba legislature and blocking, the political will of the Canadian state in 1990, the Oka, events, and the many, events and struggles involved against pipelines, for land defense, etc. They owe that militancy to the origins of Red Power in the 1960s.
Absolutely. I think that's very insightful, and I agree that we should hold on to what we learned from that history, right? Because we tend to, but both good and bad, right? We tend to idealize a lot of the past, right? Or these past movements, at least speaking from left movements, right? There are a lot of those past activism moments that are idealized, and perhaps they shouldn't be necessarily. Verdiac is a good example of that when you were talking about his famous manifesto book. But adding on to this, you also mentioned that these movements were defeated, which seems unlikely because there was such a movement in the 60s, right? You call it, you refer to it as the 68, right? The 68 wave that was hitting in France, England, and so on, right? And so there seemed to be a real movement towards these radical movements, grassroots movements, workers' movements, decolonial movements, working together. And a lot of them failed or changed into something else. And I'm curious, at least in the Canadian perspective, why you think that is, right? What obviously it's a complicated question that would take many many minutes to explain, but is there a way that you can succinctly explain why those movements didn't pan out in the way that they maybe should have?
Well, that is a very complicated question, and a very important one. I think the starting point for me would be to say we must never underestimate the staying power and the capacity to adapt of capital of its colonial state, and the ways in which it can use both the carrot and the stick, and also the fundamental point that movements of resistance, however firmly determined they may be, always swim within, in the modern period, the material realities of capitalism, which extends beyond individual capitalists and even the capitalist state. So that, for instance, if you want to look at why, for instance, the mobilizations of the 60s, not entirely, but in many ways, sort of fell into periods where their resiliency and their authority and their power was far less. It's very complicated. On the one hand, I do see the economic downturn of the mid-1970s as decisive in shattering, for instance, the hold that a radical labor movement had on working people. As it confronted deindustrialization, wage and price controls, capital's digging in its heels and saying, okay, we can no longer afford the concessions, it was pushed back. Now, the trade union movement, which is a defensive movement of workers to consolidate, their economic well-being within capitalism, is not inherently socialist. It's not inherently transformative. It then lowered its sights. It necessarily, tightened its belt. It limited its sense of struggle. Okay, that was happening at the same time that that left-wing movements, which had been in some senses both the labor movement's conscience and its prod to push, those left-wing movements, many of them were under assault by the state. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the response to the FLQ and the October crisis, I mean, which wasn't just an attack on the FLQ, on, quote, terrorism. It became an attack on any and all dissidents. Thousands were arrested, literature seized. It was a throwback in some senses to the Padlock Law of Maurice Duplessis' attack on communists and other dissidents in the late 1930s. But that attack in Quebec was only one of a number of attacks on trade union power and authority that whittled away the capacity of the unions to fight back. A subjective attack, that complemented and intensified the objective attack of, material life changing for much the worse. As that happened, at the same time, the state was forced by indigenous militants to back away from its long-standing policy imperative of coerced assimilation of indigenous peoples. So in 1969, the last gasp of that coercive assimilation project was the Trudeau-Chrétien attempt to basically impose on Indigenous peoples a new, quote, bargain, the white paper, which essentially said, and this was the irony, Indigenous militants had often been attacking the Indian Act as the basic prop of their colonization, an act imposed, on Indigenous peoples in 1876, modified and added to in the 1920s and again in the 1940s or 1950. But that Indian Act, seen as really colonization's essence by Indigenous peoples, Trudeau and Chrétien said, well, let's abolish this. Let's end Indigenous distinction and the entitlements that you have. He didn't use words entitlements, but let's end this and make you citizens like any other. It seemed in a liberal kind of paradigm a very progressive and positive thing, and it resonated with some Indigenous peoples who'd been calling for the end of the Indian Act. But it didn't take Indigenous militants long to realize, okay, we end this, and what do we have? All of our treaty entitlements, all of the ways in which we've wrestled from capital some kind of semblance of very poor, but nonetheless some restitution for what colonialism has done. All of that will be obliterated, will be cut loose, and without any actual material aid, we'll be the poorest of the poorest and mired in that for eternity. So they fought that back. And what was interesting was that ended, in some senses, at least the state's capacity to rhetorically push coercive assimilation. The state then shifted gears into a sort of rhetoric of recognition and reconciliation. But again, without the material sustenance that would actually lend some meaning and substance to those policies. But what that did was, interestingly, at the same time that the labor movement was now being attacked rather than legitimized as it had been in the 1940s, and the push of capital in the state was to contain and constrain and coerce organizations of workers, organizations of Indigenous people were given just the opposite. They now became a kind of focus of, a rhetoric and a facade of recognition. Money got pumped into Indigenous organizations, and in so doing, it created bodies of Indigenous people and First Nations that were more tied into capital and the state. Red power took a bit of a nosedive. Lee Maracle, who wrote a book, who was also known as Bobby Lee in the New Left 1960s, wrote a book, and she basically lays out this. So does Howard Adams. And so you had the divide and conquer offer a facade of legitimation to Indigenous peoples and anti-colonial voices among them. At the same time that the workers' movement, both the far left, is being attacked and undermined by RCMP surveillance and dirty tricks, and some of those far left organizations were also imploding inside themselves of their own accord. Harsh debates over strategic orientation and tactics. So what's very interesting is after the 1960s, you get exactly the opposite of what happened before the 1960s. Before the 1960s, it was Indigenous peoples and their organizations which were being repressed and stomped down on by the state, and a policy of coercive assimilation articulated. The labor movement, which was rising up in that same period, was ultimately offered some concessions, some carrots. After the 1960s, exactly the opposite happens. Indigenous peoples get offered the carrots, the labor movement and working people get offered the stick. And what this does, of course, is it further bifurcates the possibility of those two mobilizations of resistance coming together. And it seems to me that's the history of the period we live in.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy, which goes back to the 1880s, right?
Yeah.
And the
For sure.
separation of the war of resistance led by Louis Riel and Métis and indigenous peoples against capitalism and against colonialism. And the rise of the labor movement and the trade unions, the Knights of Labor, the provincial workmen's associations, the beginnings of the Independent Labor Party. That tragedy of the 1880s was those class-based and indigenous-based moments of resistance were apart.
Yeah.
And they are now apart, but in different ways.
Exactly.
And the reason they're apart, and this comes back to your question, is that capital and the state are incredibly capable of reacting to, different scenarios, different circumstances. They're infinitely committed to dividing and conquering. They are very adept at using the carrot when it can be used effectively and the stick when it's necessary. And any mobilization of the resistance that's going to actually challenge capitalism and colonialism has to both understand that and understand, I think, that the only way forward is for a large mobilization of all of the dispossessed. They can actually, and this won't happen immediately, but my hope is that there will be developments in which these two mobilizations, even if they marched separately under their own banners, could find common cause, united front capacities around single issues. So, for instance, right now, Carney's, entire project, which has been given legitimation by the threat of Trump and the tariffs and Canadian sovereignty,
the elbows up and whatever. Yeah.
Which is not, elbows up until it's better to have elbows down is basically the project. But Carney is moving against workers in the labor movement, and he's moving against indigenous peoples and their right to consult on a variety of national projects that threaten
environmental activism.
Now, I don't expect indigenous militants to automatically gravitate towards the work, towards labor and say, we are one with you. But they could say, there could be a march in which it was said, okay, we oppose what Doug Ford's doing in the Ring of Fire. We oppose what Mark Carney's doing in the public sector. We oppose incursions on the right to strike. We oppose the repudiation of projects of reconciliation and recognition. And let's have a demonstration in which, the indigenous banners can proclaim one, the labor movement's banners can proclaim the other, but they march together in opposition. And in doing that, it seems to me, this is always, there will be possibilities for discussion, more and more, reaching of agreement on common ground, more and more understanding of the particularities of struggles, and the possibility, as I say, of all of the dispossessed coming together. Because that promise, which I think was the promise of the 1960s, is both the way forward and the realistic way in which colonialism and capitalism are going to be challenged. It will mean, by the way, that there will be struggles within both of these camps against ossified trade union bureaucracies, against indigenous bands that have signed on to pipeline and oil development and the capitalist project. But that's an inevitable project of clarifying resistance.
I have a few things to add on to that. This was a great answer, and thank you so much. On the contemporary kind of overlap between anti-capitalist and anti-colonial movements, you could think of indigenous thinkers like Glenn Coulthard or Leanne Simpson, who have written more and more about this in their recent works, about these kind of overlaps in resistance and protest, or whatever you want to call it, right? And operating both on indigenous issues and labor issues, but anti-capitalist issues more broadly, right? This is especially true with Coulthard's work. So that might be an interesting path forward of thinking through that. But to add on to the earlier part of your answer, as that kind of 70s or mid 70s resistance to the 60s protests, right, that you were talking about, it's also, I don't think, coincidental for readers who may have, or for listeners who may not have read the book just yet, that this is also the time when you start to see a push towards multiculturalism as a state policy, right? And this is not me railing against the idea of multiculturalism. I should say, right, the idea of like many people getting together and overlapping and intermixing with cultures is a fantastic one. But the way that it was used rhetorically, right, as a state project, both has a tendency to undermine certain demands and flatten, right, populations, both immigrant populations and local populations, in a way that is rather colonial and destructive, right? And it's also around this time that you see, referendum projects and the accords, right, that re-entrench state power in many ways in Canada. So you see these kind of movements operating all at the same time in a way that I think complements the answer that you were giving earlier. And I just wanted to mention that as, I think, an important part of this whole resistance or clapback against Indigenous and labor movements in the 60s. I don't know if you had anything to add, but yeah.
No, and Capital signs onto that too. It uses it. I mean, you see, is it Benetton, the marketing essentially, multiculturalism in terms of its sales of particular kinds of fashions. Exactly, and I think what that does is all of this, Meyer's official state orchestrated multiculturalism in the inequalities, hidden inequalities, masked inequalities of the market. And it tends to create an illusion of the possibility of capitalism actually, providing for all groups, the best of all possible worlds. So yeah, I think that's vitally important, and it speaks to, consumerism as something that has to be overcome by these movements of resistance and challenge to capitalism and colonialism. So I think that's, again, it is the arsenal of capital and the state is composed of guns and butter, to use an old, Keynesian kind of formulation, and it is incredibly diverse. And always has been, and it's going to continue to be. And that's why a part of the reason the struggle to both bring mobilizations of potential resistance together and to mount them in ways that actually has a realistic assessment of what needs to be done. It's incredibly difficult, but also desperately necessary at the current time. And you did mention the environmental issues before, and this is something where, again, the workers and their voices in the labor movement and Indigenous peoples very much need to be on the same page. There needs to be a recognition in the labor movement that, which is a real difficulty, right? That not all jobs are necessarily, and the access to those jobs are not necessarily the best way that a far-seeing labor movement needs to operate. And I do think that the labor movement's origins in the slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all," is actually something that the trade unions need to get back to, rather than, our organization and its dues are what matter. And absolutely, as decimated as the labor movement has become, and as far as it has retreated, it is still a major voice of potential resistance. It has power that, again, linked to anti-colonial struggles and indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples on their own will not be able to mount. Indigenous peoples can mount very effective hunger strikes and encampments, etc. They can occupy territory, but that and the necessity of doing that needs to be linked to the labor movement's capacity to actually curtail production, which is what is going to, cause capital to sit up and take notice.
I'm seeing the time fly, and we've already been talking for an hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, of course. But one of the things that I find interesting, just to move up in our timeline of this history, is that you do end rather recently your history, this 3-volume history, right, in 2025. So post-COVID, post-Trump. And one of the things that I find interesting to think about is from a historical perspective, right, how you end up writing a history of the present, right? Because we've been talking about a lot of, obviously, like past movements where we have archives or we have the benefit of hindsight and that kind of pondering. But when we're thinking about something that happened last year at the time of this recording, right, how do you acknowledge that, or how do you come to terms with that, or how do you think about that from a historical perspective? And I'm just curious from a methodological standpoint how you approach things like COVID, which are relatively fresh, or the Trumpian moment, which are still ongoing, right, from that perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when I got into being an historian, I did so largely out of an interest of struggles in the present. It wasn't that I believed that history automatically repeats itself, or that there are just transparent and easily digested lessons that one can discern. On the other hand, what history does provide is a set of, it seems to me, is, if one looks at it carefully, is an ongoing chronicle of oppression and exploitation and resistance and fighting back. Now, in that chronicle, you can see moments and developments, turns not taken, mistakes made, victories won that then turn into defeats because the consequences of consequences are very often not what one expects. And so, in some senses, when you asked, what method I would use in as an historian trying to decipher the present, it seems to me that the method of interpreting the past and the present is not all that different. And this is one reason why I'm a Marxist. And it took a long time for me to say that I was a Marxist, not because I was shy about the term, but because I believe one had to kind of serve one's time, one's apprenticeship, if you will, in becoming a Marxist. And so,
sure.
But after a certain period of time, and I'm 75 now, and I think I've earned that right.
You've earned your badge, yeah.
And but Marxism provides an approach to capitalism and colonialism that I think allows one to interpret the 18th century with sophistication and 2026 in August. It allows one a predictive capacity, and it allows one the capacity to actually step outside the boundaries of mainstream thought, to draw connections between what seem to be very dissonant developments. So, for instance, those who will argue that Trump is sui generis and really an entirely new species of capital, I don't see that. And it allows one to see Trump's for instance, Trump's statements about being an advocate of peace and an isolationist. And to say, and this was actually, I think, fairly transparent to predict, that, okay, the isolationist of today is probably going to be the warmonger of tomorrow. And that, for many people, it's just Trump's inconsistencies. But I don't see that. I mean, Trump was always, as a bourgeois politician within an American empire who wanted to extend the imperial presidency, he was always going to regard the Western Hemisphere as his to control. And as American capital has often done, he's perfectly willing to go into the Middle East if he thinks it's going to work. Now, Trump is also incautious, reckless, and capable of incredible blunders. And I think the Iran war was exactly that. But but he is capable of wreaking destruction on a massive scale, which the Iranian people have certainly, experienced. And, so, and that was, it was not difficult for me to actually see Carney as someone who was not going to be the answer in terms of colonialism and capitalism, was not even going to effectively fight, Trump's threatened incursions, which for the most part were, bluster. I mean,
Yes.
The 51st state got everybody agitated, but it wasn't really what was going to happen. And some people actually felt that that a threatened invasion of Canada was going to be possible. I don't see that as in the cards. American capital has always controlled what it has in Canada through the actual material force of, the capitalist economy and its place within it. It will continue to do so. But the tragedy for me, in part, is that aside from these two streams of the anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggle being kind of so differentiated and disparate and driven apart, one tragedy is the way in which, an anti-capitalist ethos, which certainly was present among youth radicals, never a majority of the people, but a significant portion of the generation of the 60s, had an implicit anti-capitalist kind of perspective. It needed to be developed, cultivated, etc. But it was, again, we've lost that. And and Canadians clearly saw an investment banker as the answer to crises that in part had been fueled and developed by investment bankers. And so, Gramsci once said that illusion is the most pernicious weed in the human consciousness. And that illusion allowed Trump really to create probably the most effective and quickest and most bloodless regime change in modern history. I mean, because we would have had Polyev, which I don't see as any, obviously I do not see that as any answer. But, there was a significant regime change. But that regime change, then, what it's turned into is that everything that one could say, however weak-kneed and rhetorical it was, everything that might have been positive in Justin Trudeau's Liberals has now been jettisoned as capitalism is threatened, as the threat to Canadian capitalism appears. The sops to colonialism in Carney, they're just dispensed with.
Absolutely.
And the sops to labor. I mean, there is no minister of labor anymore in the Carney cabinet. There's a minister of jobs and employment or some such. I forget the actual term, but and that's the orientation. That's the orientation.
And to continue on this parallel, right? The way in which Carney was seen as kind of left progressive version of the two candidates, because we'll not pretend that we have more than two candidates, right? In Canada, right? As the left version, also belies this kind of history post 1970s of absolutely diminishing the field of horizon, right? Of politics, right? Where, as you said, a banker is considered the left wing of Canadian mainstream politics at this point, which is a mind-boggling thing to even consider. And having not been born at the time, but I feel like a lot of people in the 60s would have laughed at anyone who claimed that such a statement to be true.
Yeah, it really does speak to the narrowing of political horizons in our time. I mean, the NDP has both been reduced in its parliamentary capacities, and in the Trudeau-Singh era, it basically sealed its fate by hitching its cart to the Liberal bandwagon. The Liberal Party has moved, and was doing so under Trudeau, but it has moved even more decisively in this direction, into becoming a corporate liberal, party where, Bill Davis, the pink Tory, supposedly premier of Ontario in the 1960s, he's to the left in some, he was to the left in some senses of Carney's government. And of course, the Conservatives have moved into the territory of the alt-right, virtually. So essentially, social democracy has been written off the table and abandoned. Now, there's some view that, Avi Lewis is going to resurrect that. I'm a bit skeptical. I think he made a lot of concessions in order to get to where he's gotten. He was incredibly quiet in the leadership debates on Palestine. He's made subsequent noises, but he was incredibly quiet on what was a deep fissure in the NDP, and he shelved pretty much his more strident anti-fossil fuels program that was associated with the LEAP manifesto that he and Naomi Klein were in part architects of in an earlier period. So we'll see. And we'll see if they can come back, given the pressuring of politics in our time under the threat of Trump's, tariffs and dismantling of Kuzma, et cetera. We'll see if they can manage to come back. But Carney's also, he is quite Machiavellian and quite incredible. I mean, he can entice an NDP member from the north to cross the floor, and he can entice conservatives to cross the floor because he is a centrist. Centrist is actually too kind to him. He's moved the liberals more and more in the direction of traditional conservatism.
Exactly.
On fiscal policies, on everything else, on immigration, etc. So and yet I think, as pessimistic as I may be, given the realities of the time, this opens the door for a socialist, more revolutionary possibility for the left outside of the NDP, and challenging both the liberals and the conservatives as agents of different versions of capitalism and colonialism. Yeah. Because the premise is very much on capitalism and colonialism and their survival and their continuity, and the obliteration of a recognition that, these are not functional, foundational elements of Canada that have contributed to the well-being, broken down barriers of inequality, and advanced and, a progressive nation state.
No, to add on to that, kind of hinting towards some kind of positivity, and I do agree that I tend to be very cynical in these days and in this day and age, but I don't think it's a coincidence that, at least just looking around where I live, right, that you do see a kind of rising of more anti-capitalist and decolonial sentiment, right? Just with posters or the way that people talk about this moment. As I mentioned earlier, I was in Manitoba earlier this month, and you still see people actively talk about this potential, right, in the home of, right, the Winnipeg strike back in the day or whatever, just to harken back to history. So this kind of rhetoric and this pull towards other options, I think, is starting to pick up steam. Maybe not as quickly as one would like, and maybe not on the scale that we're talking about here and overlap. I do think it is there, just to add on to the positivity that we're trying to end on in this case.
Yeah, and I would recognize that the positive components of the current moment.
Sure.
For instance, among youth, and I think youth are the hope of the future. The project of bringing these streams together is a protracted one, and I don't imagine that even I will see it necessarily in my lifetime. But hopefully, youth will carry it on. And I think what you have to recognize is that today's youth, and Gaza is a reflection of this, are far more radical and progressive than youth at any time, even maybe than the 60s in general terms, around questions of, misogyny, homophobia, even, inequality and oppression. And youth today see their passage to the good life blocked. I mean, the gig economy is what many of them can hope for. They know that, now they know that precariousness is their lot in labor. And I would only add that, but they should also think historically. I mean, the only time that labor has not been precarious was in that golden age from about 45 to 65, where there were relatively open access to the job market. Before that, labor has always been precarious. But anyway, that's another point. So the positive thing is there are clear indications that young people have better positions than they have often had in the past. That said, the question that always emerges for me is, are they going to recognize that what is needed is an actual political organization that draws together all of the dispossessed? Or are they going to hive off their progressivism and radicalism in particular silos and see this silo as privileged over this silo? That, in a nutshell, that's what I'm trying to, challenge. And
definitely,
as negative as I may be about the realities of the present, I wouldn't have spent my time writing 3 books about it if I didn't think that there was actually an option and a possibility in the future of something better coming along.
I always end my interviews, because so far we've talked about mostly the third volume, right? We've referenced this first and second volume here and there, but we've talked about, right, the movements in the 60s, neoliberalism, multiculturalism. We've talked about all kinds of topics. And I always end my interviews, no matter who I talk to, with one very specific question. And that is, what didn't I ask in this interview? And what is the answer to that question?
Sorry, I didn't. What
did I not ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question? It's journalism 101.
Well, you covered a lot. One thing you raised in our kind of written discussions before the podcast was taped, was you raised the question of settler colonialism. And and we haven't touched on that. And in some senses, that's the elephant in the room. In a way, you posed it as are my books a counter to this. Maybe that's too angular a formulation, but often people might ask me that. And I don't think they are a counter to settler colonialism. I think they are a complication of settler colonialism. And in some senses, the whole issue of settler colonialism was one that my publisher really didn't want me to address, because he wanted to sell books in chapters in Indigo, and he wanted an accessible, treatment of Capitalism and Colonialism from the left, admittedly, but actually not weighted down with what he felt might be the jargon of the, graduate seminar, etc. And I was entirely open to writing, trying to write like that. It's not easy, and it was a struggle. And he did push me, and sometimes in good ways, and sometimes in ways I kind of wanted to resist. But one reason I was first of all, the positive value of the term settler colonialism is that it forces people to address colonialism and indigenous dispossession. It has basically, if it hasn't put a knife to our neck, it's put a microphone to our mouth and said, look, address this. And that's good. That's a positive, because, when I was starting out as an academic in the 70s, not a lot of this was discussed. And I became a labor historian, and it was very easy to write labor history without actually addressing any of these questions of indigenous dispossession and colonialism. So pushing us in that direction has been a real positive in terms of the settler colonial paradigm. However, that said, and I felt, therefore, that what really needed to be done was to actually write a history and then see if the history actually fits. And this is not really what many people who've embraced settler colonialism have actually done. They really have not tried to interrogate the history. And so, for instance, I would say that there are three levels upon which settler colonialism needs to be complicated. One is on the theoretical literature that actually exists, that is focused on the writings of Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Verancini, and many others. I would hope that people would look at that literature and approach it critically. I found a lot wanting in it. They do raise a lot of important questions, but one of the questions they don't address very well, I think, is the history of the working class. Now, this is on a number of levels, but from a Marxist vantage point, the very term settler colonialism is an homogenizing term. It simply considers all settlers to be the same. And so I retreat from that, or distance myself from that, or raise questions about it. There are other ways in which it needs to be interrogated with respect to the Canadian case. I think with respect to Israel and settlers in the West Bank, etc., it may have far more purchase on the actual experience, particularly now, even more so than it would have in the 1940s and the beginnings of Israel, where there were Zionists, however one might want to be critical of them, who actually saw the necessity of Arab and Jewish coexistence and alignment in the Middle East, and that is gone. That's gone now. But in Canada, for instance, a very famous quote from Patrick Wolfe is that settler colonialism is about the elimination of the native. Now, there are many instances in Canadian history where you can say yes, genocidal instances. You can really see this at certain points and certain times. But one, for instance, area where Wolfe stipulates that the elimination of the native happens is not necessarily through genocidal assault and violence, but through intermarriage. Intermarriage he sees as essentially eliminating the native and assimilating the native to the settler colonial civil society. Well, in Canada, we have a problem with that. Are you going to tell Métis peoples that they are not colonized? Are you going to tell them that not only are they compromised in their very being, but that their children are in fact part of the settler colonial project of elimination? I don't want to be saying that to Métis people that I know, and I would
Nope.
be very kind of I'd be wondering and bewildered about anybody who would.
Absolutely.
Um, so that and we have to recognize that it was indigenous women who struggled against that very issue when they fought to have their exclusion under the Indian Act from their entitlements as indigenous people because they married outside their quote colonial recognized band.
Exactly.
When this came up over the course of from the 1960s into the 1980s, when that Indian Act, was finally, revised to eliminate that, they faced a lot of opposition from some male band leaders and chiefs. Um, there were young girls, daughters of mothers who were fighting this, who appeared before royal commissions in Ottawa and said, "Well, a dog can be buried on my reserve, but I can't." So that question of the elimination of the native and how settler colonialism poses it is a problem in Canada, very much a problem. And there are, okay, so that's the conceptual, like let's read this literature in its origins, which I think a lot of people who are kind of just accepting the settler colonial paradigm have not really engaged with. There's an empirical problem too, an historical problem. Is this settler colonialism applicable throughout Canadian history as we know it? Well, it doesn't really have much purchase on a period, the fur trade centuries, that indigenous peoples would say was pretty central to their dispossession and colonization. The settlers are not really a factor in that. And if you jump forward even to the 20th century and Inuit relocations in the Arctic, it's about those not bands, those Inuit groups that were moved from certain areas to other areas. It was about the state's bureaucracy. It was about capital and resource extraction, and control over their territories, which were immense territories that nomadic groups of Inuit utilized for subsistence. But I don't see it as being driven by settler colonialism. And then there is ultimately the political project, finally. So if you have the conceptual and the actual writings on settler colonialism, if you have the empirical problems, the historical moments, it's not to say that in certain areas and regions and in certain historical periods, some of the settler colonialism orientation doesn't fit. It does. And I don't deny that in the book. So people could be reading these books and say, okay, I'm not convinced that settler colonialism isn't the way we need to look at it. My hope is that they'll be looking at it and problematize things more. But the third area, and this is the one where, as I keep coming back to, the reason for the book being written, in homogenizing settlers, in obliterating the distinctions between capital and the state that serves its interests, and the vast majority of working people who, even if they are racist, and I don't discount that there are elements of racism in the working class, not all workers, but certainly racism has a foothold in the working class. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And we need to confront that and address it, not romanticize it. But in homogenizing, but the other point is, who benefits from that racism more? Qui bono. And to me, it's capital and it's state. And you are not going to, it seems to me, create the alliances and the marching together, even if at times under separate banners, of anti-colonial indigenous peoples and potentially anti-capitalist non-indigenous peoples, if you simply see Canada as settlers versus indigenous, as settlers colonialism and a settler state, which is a term used, but does that mean the state is in the interests of all settlers in Canada? I mean, I can't wrap my head around that, really.
No, I would disagree with that one thoroughly.
That's really I was writing the books agnostic on it, in some senses, on settler colonialism, appreciative of its prod, its push, its demands to address areas that had been too long off the table of interpretation and conceptualization, but questioning of many of its premises and applicability. And in the end, you know, the argument about, how does one struggle against colonialism? It can, we can march together under a banner for a time, at least, a time of, learning and exploration of each other's positions. We can march under a banner in which we are both opposed to colonialism, regardless of how one names it. In some senses, I've written a book that was a critique of postmodernism and its kind of reification of language. I mean, maybe the left needs to get out of a reification of language and instead invest in a practice of struggle.
It's a really interesting note to end on. I don't know if I have an answer to that, right? I can see where you're going, but it's a good question to end on.
Yeah. I'm happy to end there and leave it open-ended.
Absolutely. Bryan, I cannot thank you enough for your insightful answers and honestly, these 3 wonderful books. I think I don't say this very often. These are books that will become indispensable in my shelf, both as a teacher and just someone who is interested in the history of Canada, right, past and current, as we talked about. And I encourage listeners to find it. It's published by Formac Press, right? Or
James Lorimer.
Lorimer, sorry.
He has 2 publications, but
right. So I got them confused. I'm sorry, but yeah, Lorimer Press. And yeah, do you want to mention to listeners if there's any way to get into contact with you, or you'll just leave it at that?
I'll probably just leave it at that. Most people can probably find me if they want to, and
No
maybe advertising it might be less than useful for me. But
no,
anybody can contact me if they want. Anyway, it was very nice to talk to you. The questions were intelligent, and I really am. It's gratifying to hear you view the books the way you do. Thank you.
Absolutely.